Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the luncheon. I hope everybody's having a wonderful time. Some of you got to the beach, I see. What I'd like to do is start with, if you would, I don't know if all of you know, but there was an incident in Virginia up by D.C. There was a shooting. I'd like to start the luncheon with a moment of silence for those that could have been injured. If you would, please bow your heads. Thank you very much. I would like to start by saying thank you again. I know that most of you have been at most of the events. I hope you're having a good conference. Hope you're getting what you need here. We do appreciate your comments, and there will be surveys sent out. So please take the time, put your comments down, and answer those surveys, because we do take them to heart. The BOAF staff puts the surveys together, and if we can improve next year, that's the way we try to do that. I don't mind you coming up and talking to me or the other officers, but the surveys at the end of the conference will be coming out, and if you could please look at those and take the time to answer those questions. Okay, so moving on, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Mark Neveau. Mark was the FEMA Federal Coordinator Officer in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. He's here to tell us some of the untold stories. If you would, please give a round of applause for Mark Neveau.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. How are we today? Are you enjoying the conference? It looks like it's going very well, very well. What we'd like to do is talk to you today a little bit about Hurricane Sandy. Why Hurricane Sandy? It's 5 years old. Let's talk about it. It was a superstorm. I want you to take a look at the picture on the screen. Tell me, do you think that's real or dramatic effect? Real? Keep that in mind as we progress. We're going to come back and visit that in just a moment. Let me tell you a little bit about what a federal coordinating officer does. Is anybody familiar with that? Yeah, not one person. That's what I thought. Fair enough. In any state in our country, when there is a disaster of magnitude and the governor requests assistance, that assistance request goes through a FEMA channel. There are 10 FEMA regions. Yours is based in Atlanta. That request from the governor goes through FEMA up to the White House. The President of the United States is the only person that has authorization in our country to actually declare an emergency or a major presidential declaration. When he does that, that allows the state to have access to all federal departments as well as the Disaster Relief Fund. This is some of the language that comes from the Stafford Act, authorizing federal coordinating officers to conduct business on behalf of the federal government, but in partnership with state officials. The governor's appointee, which we have in the audience today, Brian Kuhn, and he's going to be speaking to you later this afternoon. Our goal is to try and provide the assistance to that state. But I always want to keep myself and my feet grounded a little bit. Yeah, you might have orders from the President of the United States, but let's not get a big head. And so I always revisit this. Does anybody remember in the 70s Rodney Dangerfield and his great line? What was that?
I tell you, I don't get no respect at all.
That's how I feel sometimes, a federal coordinating officer. That said, let's continue. This is one page out of an operational briefing that takes place each day, produced out of FEMA headquarters for senior executives. What it does is it talks about resources and assets available on that particular day. And if you'll look here, total workforce, who's deployed, available, it talks about these teams right here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. There are 3 national teams that the President and the FEMA administrator are able to deploy to the most complex disasters within the country. These are time frames and where they're supposed to operate. If you notice, the East team's on Bravo 48 time, meaning they've got to be wherever they're summoned to within 48 hours on site. If you take a look, Charlie is actually at rest. The 3rd team is on a Bravo 2-hour notice. They've got to be wherever they're summoned to within 2 hours. As you move through, you can see different resources here. And if you look down about 3 columns, they list the federal coordinating officers. There are 36, but there are about 30 that actually deploy to different disasters in the country. How many of them are deployed right now? Does it show, or how many are available? 14, correct. The other ones are deployed across the United States in different operations. Some of them are doing what's known as a recovery operation, where severe weather came in, and so they're out there granting money on behalf of the federal government, providing funds so that the state and local jurisdictions can rebuild in the aftermath of a disaster. What I want to do today is paint a picture for you. I want to paint a picture for the building officials of Florida. What would happen if a Category 3 hurricane rolled through your state? We're going to talk a little bit about disaster housing, why, and the expectations that you're going to face. S times 4, the stories of Superstorm Sandy. Could this happen in Florida? A shining example of resilience. We're going to talk about one solution for you. We want to leave you with some information today, not just out of concern about what we're talking about, but maybe how we move forward as building officials of Florida. And we want you to think about preparation. That's going to be critical. Whether you go back out of this conference today and you take action, or you just think about it, that's what we're urging you to do. Preparation. This whole story starts on a beautiful day in Duluth, Minnesota, when yours truly is deployed to a recovery operation. We'd been there about 5 weeks. We had Spartan accommodations, and I finally landed a hotel with a beautiful view. Lake Superior, it was wonderful. Having coffee, 8 to 5 job, everything was good. Check my BlackBerry. Next thing I have is an email from FEMA headquarters. October 30th, the storm had just rolled through New York. Mark, prepare to move soonest to support Mike Byrne. The gentleman in the picture is Mike Byrne. He is a retired battalion chief from the New York Fire Department. He was designated as the federal coordinating officer for the state of New York. The other gentleman, you can kind of tell, the President of the United States. There's the mayor of New York, the governor, state of New York, United States Senator from New York, Chuck Schumer, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Mike says, I call Mike on the phone, and he says, Mark, just get here as soon as you can, and we'll touch bases. Sounds good. Little digression. The gentleman, the United States Senator from New York, it's kind of an interesting tidbit. Do you know he's the first minority leader in the United States Senate that comes from New York? He's also the first of Jewish descent, which is kind of interesting. More importantly, do you know who she is? Amy Schumer, the comedian, related to Chuck Schumer. Very staunch individual and a cutting-edge comedian. It's kind of interesting. Little tidbit. This is New York. What area is that of New York? Does anybody know? Yes, Lower Manhattan. I talked to Mike on the phone. He says, Mark, just get here as quick as you can. Sounds good. I fly into Philadelphia. I rent a Suburban. I'll meet staff in New York. Uh-oh. I'd never been to New York. I really hadn't. I'm like this wide-eyed college kid heading off to college trying to figure out what I'm doing. And I'm trying to get from Philadelphia to Brooklyn, New York, and the tunnels are closed and the roads are closed and everything's, everything's shut down. Let's go back here. No lights. Meet me in Brooklyn. Took me a tremendous amount of time to figure out where I was going. The funny part, I actually got nervous about the toll plazas and the toll roads. I kid you not. I'm driving to the second largest hurricane, didn't know it at the time, in our country's history, and I reach the toll plaza and nobody's there. It says exact change. I don't have exact change. What am I going to do? In FEMA, that's one of, I'm going to get a ticket, the cameras are going to catch me, they're going to send it to the rental car agency, then they're going to call me, and the headquarters are going to, what's going on here? And it's like, it's a bureaucracy. Those are the things that get you tripped up. I was so nervous trying to get through the toll plaza. I hit the second toll plaza, there's a big sign. Nobody around. Nobody on the roads. Big sign. Go through. We went home. Hurricane Sandy. Yes. I get to Brooklyn. Mike says very simply, Mark, please go to Long Island, figure out what's going on. I got my hands full in New York City, state of New York, just go do it. So for those of you unfamiliar with Long Island represents some of the wealthiest folks in the Western Hemisphere, the Hamptons. It also makes up Nassau and Suffolk County, two working class counties. The population of Long Island is about 7.8 million, if you're including Brooklyn and Queens. In this particular case, we broke out those two components. 118 miles long, 23 miles wide. Go figure out what's going on there and handle it. Sounds good, boss. I'll get back to you. Keep in mind this area as we start to move through, right here. Superstorm Sandy was the largest recorded hurricane on the Atlantic in history. 80-mile-an-hour winds, full moon. 20% sea rise because of the full moon. How many of you, this is a little test question, in the eye of a hurricane, Brian, don't answer this, in the eye of a hurricane, where is the most damaging and greatest wind force? Anybody know? Sir. Backside? Oops. Typically, left front of the eye. As it moves through, in this case, you can see the eye moving left front. Look what's right in the way of that. Long Island, New York. They nicknamed this Superstorm Sandy because of confluence of the frontal storm, the winds, etc. Now, mind you, New York had not been impacted by a hurricane of this magnitude. Why does any of this matter? Why should it matter to you? We're in Florida. Because the projections for 2017 are this. Depending upon who you talk to, Colorado, 30-year average, NOAA, Weather Channel. You all will face up to 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, 3 Category 3 hurricanes. That's the projection for the state of Florida for this year. So what does that mean? Categories of hurricane. Very simply, 1 through 5. 1 being not so bad, 5 being the worst. What is the prediction for here? 3 Cat 3s. What does that mean? Cat 3, 111 to 130 mile an hour winds, extensive damage at landfall, and a storm surge of 9 to 12 feet. Imagine the water out there rising 9 to 12 feet with hurricane-force winds coming ashore. This is from CNN about 3 weeks ago. U.S. in the longest stretch without a Category 3 hurricane. The state of Florida, little history, I'm sure you probably know this, but the Sunshine State has direct hits, 5 storms Category 2, 18 Category 4s, 42 Category 3 storms. 6 of the 9 most powerful hurricanes in the United States have made landfall in Florida. 10 costliest hurricanes in the United States. Sandy, number 2. It's a Category 2 storm. Look at that list. How many of those do you recognize? Quite a few. Category 3, Category 3, Category 4. How about housing? Why do we want to talk about housing in Florida? We can focus on a number of different things in a hurricane, but we're going to talk about housing, and this is why. This comes out of Florida's Emergency Management Strategy Disaster Housing Plan. Let me read some excerpts. There's over 7 million housing units in Florida. 70% of the housing stock was built prior to the new building codes established in the 90s, which do not meet higher wind loading standard, making them more vulnerable to high winds. The state's heavy economic reliance on agricultural and tourism industries attract large number of migrant workers. These economically challenged populations may pose housing placement challenges, which are plagued by language barriers and demand social services. In Florida, 28% of your households are 65 and older. Why is that important? Those populations also require a tremendous support of services. You can't simply put them elsewhere if their housing's destroyed because of a hurricane. You have to make determinations as to where you're going to move those folks. That being said, let me add some more. This is from Hurricane Sandy. It just talks about the storm surge a little bit. But I want you to please take note at this comment. The president has said to governors and mayors, we're going to eliminate red tape so that we can get you the resources you need. The expectation is that state and local will do the same. Streamline red tape so that we can get people into housing quickly. How difficult is that going to be with all the parameters and the things that you're going to face? This is wording out of State of Florida Disaster Housing Strategy. Streamline permitting and site development when site receives selection. What they're referring to is temporary housing sites. If we can't find apartments, hotels, etc., to be able to move people to, we're going to create temporary housing sites. Streamline the process. But you all have to manage public safety, but also have to provide housing. So how do we provide safety for folks when people are displaced, injured and killed, homes and businesses are impacted? There's political implications. In this case for Sandy, there was a presidential election looming. You have a gubernatorial election next year. Infrastructure was compromised. Sewer, water, electrical, natural gas, train, airports, etc. Snow and ice hit 4 days after. It's not something you necessarily face but what unique characteristics in Florida do you face that are going to be an impact? No hotel space. Density of land prohibited us from being able to put temporary housing units on people's front yards so that they could live there and rebuild their homes. Most urbanized disaster. Manhattan is the most urbanized area in our country. It's 27,000 people live in a square mile. Miami's about 14,000 square. Highly urbanized. More people, square mile, greater damage. Hurricane Sandy, over 100,000 homes just on Long Island were affected. That's just Long Island. The neighborhoods are our fabric to society. That's where we belong, that's where we live, that's our neighbors. Without housing, what happens to that? See the snow sitting on the debris? Remember, this isn't just debris, folks. It's Johnny's mitt, it's Sarah's ballet shoes, it's the pictures, it's the mementos that are sitting out in front of people's homes. The upper picture is storm surge that came through these folks' home, ripped out the kitchen. You can see the force of the storm surge running through there and how the plastic sheeting has flowed with the water. It's not just about neighborhoods. It's about communities. We might be able to relocate 100 people, 200, but when we're talking about entire communities, how are we going to do that? Where are they going to go? It's lives lost. Sometimes in our business, we just talk about the technical components to it, but we really don't put a face to it. Sometimes we forget. I want to share a little story with you. This is Zoe. Zoe is a 19-year-old college student at the time. She was in her dorm at Rutgers University. She was getting ready. She was studying for finals. That's her brothers and sisters, Talia, Theodore, Theo, and Pierce. Mother and father, Richard. Richard was a chemist at Princeton. Amy, her mom, was a biotech consultant. I want to read something to you. In a moment in time, a second of bad luck changed my life and my siblings' lives forever. After her uncle called, she knew she had to get to Morristown Medical Center to see her brothers, who were transported there for treatment. I finally made it to the hospital in the morning after battling Hurricane Sandy all night. I was no longer your typical 19-year-old. A Hurricane Sandy gust blew a 100-foot tree on the cab of the truck, killing both their parents. My brothers made it out alive, but with bumps and bruises. Theodore crawled out a side window first and then pulled younger brother out the window. Emergency service workers were in the area, and the brothers flagged him down. She was planning her parents' funeral, managing the grief within their family, and figuring out how she was going to finance raising her brother and sister. It's not just statistics that we're talking about. There's thousands of businesses affected in this situation. Starbucks closed 428 outlets early to allow the employees to go home before the transportation systems had shut down. You know, 50% of our economy in our country is made up of small business. If small businesses aren't back up and operating within 12 months after a disaster, fire, flood, whatever it is, 95% of them fail. If we can't get housing, we can't get the businesses rebuilt. The economic upheaval. New York Stock Exchange, Wall Street. The last time the New York Stock Exchange was closed for more than one day was 124 years ago when Sandy hit. 124 years. This is a picture of Goldman Sachs, the #1 private equity firm in the country. How long can we exist as a country and as a state if our economy is not operating? The banking system shut down. No cash, no electronic payments. This isn't a movie, this is real. So it goes to the old adage, how much cash do you have in your wallet? Credit cards aren't going to work for us. 7 days. Long Island was out of power for up to 7 days. Recreational impacts. We kind of discount that sometimes. We think, it's just the amusement park. But it's the social fabric. It's the stress reduction on day-to-day lives. It allows us to go out and enjoy our family and bond. When those are gone, what's the impact to the community? Communications are interrupted. Verizon had its headquarters in Manhattan. That's the water flowing through the lobby of Verizon headquarters. Cell service is down. How do you text your family? How do you manage your response? Verizon's underneath this lobby, most of its hard lines were running underneath the Verizon headquarters in Manhattan. They used an air compressor to keep the groundwater out of those lines. When the storm surge came in, guess where the water went? First thing that went, compressor. Lines went down. So now you're impacting the ability for people to talk, first responders to communicate, although we have emergency networks. How does business continue to operate? 4 days after, a foot of snow fell. Utility trucks frozen in place. I love this photo because it shows a gentleman trying to dig out from the sand that was brought with a storm surge, but also the snow on the front bumper. An unfortunate circumstance. November 2nd, CBS New York reported on Long Island looting had become such a problem on the South Shore in the wake of Superstorm Sandy that state police are on patrol. In addition to the looting of homes and stores, Newsday and News 12 Long Island reported armed robberies, criminals siphoning of gasoline out of vehicle tanks, and thefts of generators. We deployed TSA, Customs and Border Patrol agents on a mission assignment to support the first responders in that area. Fires. Notice the urban search and rescue marks on the front of the mobile home. Shows that they were there. New York Team 2 went in and searched, no bodies, time, etc. What you're seeing here in terms of the fire, on October 30th, 190 firefighters fought a 6-alarm that destroyed 111 structures, damaged another 20 in Breezy Point. The area had been under evacuation orders, but some residents decided to ride it out. The rescuers were in chest-deep water in boats trying to pull them out. They suspect a transformer got wet, caused the fire. Your emergency services may be incapacitated. They may have a storm surge themselves. In this case, snow and ice. How Now, mind you, remember, they'd just gone through 4 or 5 days earlier. Their homes are damaged. They're not structurally intact. They have no electricity, no heat. Gasoline's not pumping at the particular time. So they have no place to go. The hotels are full. Let me break this for a second because sometimes we get kind of serious. I want to just show you a slide that kind of makes me laugh. Do you think that guy's listening to anything I'm actually saying to him? The facial expressions. Really, Mark? Really? You're from FEMA, really? The funny part to this is that gentleman is Peter King, United States Congressman from Long Island, CNN, ABC, CBS correspondent. He was also the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee at the time, which oversees FEMA's budget. Sewer systems compromised. Sewer system broken. This particular sewer system served 40% of Long Island, about 525,000 people. Quote, "This is the largest sewer release in the history of Long Island," said the executive director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment. Bay Park, a sprawling complex near Hewlett Park, New York City, serves 40% of Nassau County. This is a quote. "The smell of excrement still hung over the tidy neighborhood as workers in white suits tried to decontaminate homes, sewage mixed with 4 to 5 feet high floodwaters infiltrated floors and walls. And many homes had to be stripped to their wooden frames to fully decontaminate." See the line? Water came, subsided. You still are faced with a tremendous task of cleanup. Long Beach, if you remember on the map, was right in the eye of the hurricane. This was one of the major hospitals on Long Island at the time. Kind of self-explanatory here. LaGuardia and JFK airports were shut down. Approximately 81,000 people a day go through these airports. There's about 13,000 employees that work at the airports. Shut down. What do we do with those folks? We can't send them to hotels. They're full. The modes of transportation weren't operating. So now it becomes a task of finding housing at the airport for them. That's kind of what happened. Cots. This is Grand Central Station, the largest rail system in the world. 48 acres. 2 platforms. I think it's 67 tracks on the second platform, and then down below, 47. Completely empty. Your rail system's not working. Remember the picture that we started with, the scuba diver in the subway areas? Do you think that was real or dramatic effect? Millions without electricity. This is a nuclear plant that was taken offline by Entergy. It provided about 30% of electricity for New York for a period of time. People were not sitting still. Power was out for one of the longest periods in our country's history. Folks were not going to sit still for the energy company. They started to picket the headquarters on Long Island, adding to the complexity and stress of those folks trying to restore and recover from this disaster. This is a chart Energy put out. If you notice the date on the bottom, November 3rd, that's 4 days later. 456 affected customers. They say the active outages are about 7,000, 8,000. Their database couldn't keep up with the amount of work that was coming, the amount of statistics and records for power outages. United States, notice the area. Shortage of gasoline. Gas lines, not hours, days. Days. How do you move recovery vehicles, first response vehicles on surface streets when you've got cars lined up? How do you get fuel trucks into those gas stations to refill those tanks? Mass transportation, out of service, people, long lines. Cat 3 hurricane in New York. Could this happen in Florida? But at some point we start to recover. We have to recover. So the recovery begins here. House by house, neighbor by neighbor. One day at a time, we start rebuilding, brick by brick. But you all have a task before you. How do you do enough of the building inspections and the safety inspections in the short period of time that you have? You say, this doesn't affect my county or my jurisdiction. I'm inland. The tidal surge may not hit me. But what about the person sitting next to you that has to do those inspections, that needs your technical expertise and help? The quicker we get the inspections done, the quicker we can get people into housing. Why housing? We talked a little bit about it. It's the fabric of the neighborhood. It doesn't matter whether the businesses are back, the rails are running, the airports are open. If we don't have housing for folks, that's the essence. That's the building foundation of the recovery. We've got to get them into housing. You play an integral part to that. So I want to encourage you to think about it when you leave today, the preparation component. How will we handle this? What will we do? I think you have a mutual aid policy within the association that you're kind of dusting off, talking a little bit about. How will your jurisdiction handle this? If we come to you and say, hey, we need some help, the state director says we got to provide housing for folks. Where are we going to do it? Can we use your county? I know you're not affected by it, but can we put folks in your county because we've got to provide housing for the other areas? It's volunteers. This is the Southern Baptist, third largest volunteer agency within the United States. They're coming out and help. This is 24 hours prior to the kids were playing soccer on the field. This is a temporary hospital that was put up on Long Island. The doctors and nurses that staff these disaster medical assistance teams, they volunteer their time. They take time off work, their vacation from across the country to come get deployed. Gasoline starts to flow. We use strategic reserves. Power restorations underway. The power utilities have one of the best mutual aid programs, bar none. They can move trucks and resources on a moment's notice all across this country. In this particular case, Superstorm Sandy, which was not a Cat 3, additional assistance from the military to fly the trucks. Kindness in action, that's how we start to recover. This is a wonderful story. I want to share this with you. For the past 10 years, Jeff Parness has been helping others. Every September, Parness brings hundreds of volunteers from New York to help another disaster-stricken community in the United States. It's our way of saying thank you. New Yorkers will never forget what people from all over the country and the world did for us in our time of need after 9/11. So that's how the mission started. It was just to pay it forward. Over the past decade, Parness nonprofits, and it's called New York Says Thank You, that's the name, has assisted victims in wildfires in San Diego and Louisiana for tornadoes in the Midwest, Hurricane Katrina. All of our volunteers are survivors. They survived whether it was 9/11, Katrina, tornadoes. This year, Parness's mission has come full circle. This was written right after Hurricane Sandy. Last weekend, more than 300 volunteers, at least half of whom were from outside the New York area, helped rebuild 31 homes damaged by Superstorm Sandy. Donations, ice rink in Long Island, 48 hours later, completely filled with supplies donated by other Americans, the other part of the country. Currency, starting to flow money, temporary ATMs brought in by the banking system. People's attitude, we're not going to let this knock us down. We shall overcome. A smile. What's the largest expense in most disasters? Anybody know? Debris recovery. Absolutely. So all of these houses are going to move a tremendous thousands, hundreds of thousands of cubic yards. Where are they going to put it? Where does that debris go? If it comes from your shore counties, is it going to go inland? I don't know. Mobile communications, bringing the systems back up. Military and service. 2 military folks working at the local level in Emergency Operations Center. National Guard, 11,000 deployed, providing meals. Maybe a smile and a cookie. That's all it takes. Or a hug. Neighbor, providing mutual aid to neighbor. Angels, literally helping. Guardian angels. Voluntary youth faith-based groups. One of the largest percentage of recovery comes from those folks. Doesn't come from the federal government. It comes from other Americans helping Americans. Veterans. Red Cross. Offering a cup of coffee while you're cleaning out your home. So now we're going to return to normal. We want to get back to where we were. How do we know? The mail's starting to be delivered. A simple thing. Let me give you an update on Zoe. The emergency responders sent the 4 kids to Disneyland shortly after the disaster. 15 months after her home had been destroyed, one of the local news channels helped rebuild her home. They settled with the insurance company. She now has money to raise her family. She's gone back to school, wants to be a vet. Let's talk one solution real quickly. We're going to shift gears. In New York, to get people into their homes, because there was no temporary, STEP came into place, sheltering temporary emergency power. This is one prototype. Brian's going to talk about it a little bit this afternoon, but this is going to fall into your area of expertise. Because there was nowhere to put folks, we wanted to keep them in their homes. That was a unique program that says we'll repair electrical meters, shelter measures, rapid, temporary exterior repairs. So we're going to go in and try and fix some of the electrical. We're going to try and get these folks back into their home as quickly as possible. It's a little different than we typically do. So as building officials, when people come to you from the state and federal and say, FEMA is now granting money that allows residents to be able to stay in their homes that typically don't meet building code, but this is what we need to do, how do you respond to that? Take a look at the bottom paragraph. The applicant, other permits required for eligible work. They've got to come to you. And you balance, which is very critical, the safety of public with expediting housing for folks. How do you balance that? How do you do that? We want to provide you some more answers today. And so this afternoon, Chicago Bridge and Iron at 2 to 3 is going to have a breakout session, which we'll talk a little bit more about STEP. We've got an individual who is in New York. Rick, is the gentleman's name? Ayers Bradford. Is Ayers here? Is he in the room? Okay. I know he's here, so the breakout session for him. We also have Brian Kuhn. Brian, can you stand up and wave? Brian is the governor's appointee for the state of Florida. He's the emergency director. So typically in a hurricane or anything of magnitude, a federal coordinating officer partners with the state coordinating officer or the emergency manager. He's here today. He's going to talk to you at, what time is it? 3:15 to 4:15 in this room to hopefully generate some more discussion about what we've talked about and any questions you might have. So I want to leave you with this real quickly. We wanted to paint a picture for you today about disaster housing, why, what the expectations and the pressures that come to you. Some stories. Could this happen in Florida? Talked a little bit about the resilience of folks. A solution, and we want to encourage you just maybe to have a little preparation. If nothing else, just think about it. Maybe at networking tonight, hey, that guy was crazy. What'd you think about that? Nah, forget it. Maybe not. Maybe it generates conversation. Hopefully we've done what we asked. Preparation. There's some surveys you're going to be given as you walk out today. If you could kind of offer us some input, we'd really appreciate that. That's my contact information. Thank you all for your time today.